Did you know that Julius Caesar engaged in homosexual activity? The Roman Empire was one of the most powerful forces the world has ever seen. It gave history emperors like Marcus Aurelius and Antoninus Pius, who were virtuous and wise. Others, like Caligula, Commodus, and Caracalla, were monstrous, insane predators whose thirst for blood and sexual habits were beyond believable. We know so much about them because ancient historians such as Suetonius, Lucius Cassius Dio, and Pliny kept a very detailed record of everyday life and habits of these imperial superstars. Not all of the stories are true. After all, the Romans were those who invented and developed political propaganda and information spinning, but they are nevertheless fascinating. For instance, did you know that the most stable relationship of the Roman Emperor Elagabalus, who took 5 female and 1 male spouse in his life, was with his male chariot driver? The social life of Romans was quite interesting, but discussion regarding their attitude towards sexuality is rarely brought up. Considering that Western civilization is almost a direct descendant of Roman life, it should be studied and discussed more often. For instance, many people are not aware that Rome had its fair share of homosexuality, a topic that was widely considered taboo until the 20th century. When people think of the Romans, they usually think of macho men in shining armor going to fight the savages. Some of them might be in for a rude awakening. It may seem unusual that a society so far back in time was so liberal about an aspect of social life that was frowned upon for a large part of the last century. In fact, the ancient Romans were so liberal about their sexual adventures that they did not even have a word for homosexuality. People were either masculine or passive, whether male or female. Now, you might be thinking that the Roman Empire was a patriarchal society. So how did these social norms exist? Roman society was indeed patriarchal, and men occupied a position of authority. This position of authority extended to wealth, social status, and the opportunities for governance. Since the Romans also associated macho qualities with brave and disciplined men, they also associated them with brave and heroic women. However, since the upper branch of the status quo was predominantly male, they could not bear to have their masculine image tarnished. One major example in this regard was that of Julius Caesar, who was accused by his political foes of engaging in passive homosexual activity. The charge was a scandalous one, whether it was true or not. They had claimed that Julius had had a sexual relationship with King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia when he was a guest at his court. Although there is no way to know if it was true, Julius was notorious for his homoerotic escapades. His enemies often resorted to calling him the Queen of Bithynia. This reference further demonstrates the association of assertive behavior with masculinity and submissiveness with femininity. Same-gender sex was a common theme of classical antiquity, especially between males. It was considered acceptable, short of a few social situations, and the pagan religion of the Romans was also quite lenient towards it. Rome had a law called Lex Scantinia, probably used to discourage free men from having a passive role in homosexual activity. Since men were supposed to be bold and valiant, the Romans believed that they should occupy an active position. If a male of high standing was passive, it was considered a sign of weakness and femininity, and the Romans did not want to encourage this thought among their youth. There were exceptions to this rule as well. According to Lex Scantinia, freeborn men were not prosecuted for being raped, or in other words, made to be forcibly passive. The Romans thought that since the persons did not willingly engage in passive behavior, he could still serve as an example of a fearless, stalwart male that others could look upon and admire. You have to remember that the Roman way of life was wholly dependent on their military might, which may explain why they wanted active male citizens. Homosexual activity in military legions was banned and punishable by law. You might be thinking, well, if powerful men in a passive role were frowned upon, and homosexuality was banned in the most crucial part of Roman society, the military, where was it allowed? The answer is that it was quite the norm outside of these two conditions. Same-sex activity with slaves was quite common. granted that the owner, especially one in the public eye, played an active role. However, it should be noted that laws regarding what goes on behind closed doors are next to impossible to implement. If someone were somehow caught once in a while, his family name would bear the shame. However, this was rare. The Roman society had its fair share of slaves, and since freeborn citizens could not be passive, it was easy to find slaves who could be. The masters could do whatever they wanted to the slaves, whether it be violent or sexual. Since they were their properties, nobody could raise questions about the slave's age or gender. Many older men were, in fact, expected to keep a teenage boy to keep them satisfied. Sometimes the young boys in this role would even be castrated to keep them docile and passive. Since Roman society was so concerned about maintaining the status quo, the social status of the sexual partner mattered more than the person's age or sexuality. In a case of this nature, Emperor Nero was said to have married a young male. He then had the man castrated to preserve his youthful qualities. Nero married 3 women and 2 men in public ceremonies. Marriage between individuals of similar sex was never truly recognized under Roman law, but that does not mean it did not happen. For instance, we know that another ruler, Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, married a male athlete in a public ceremony. Many rulers of the Roman Empire have a history of keeping young boys to feed their sexual appetites. For instance, Emperor Tiberius had a villa on the island of Capri. Numerous depictions of homosexual and heterosexual acts have been painted of him. The building became a resort for royal events of sexual nature, whether homosexual or heterosexual. His adopted son, Caligula, is also notorious for similar parties. The most famous example is probably that of Emperor Hadrian, who kept a 13-year-old boy named Antoninus. The emperor engaged in a sexual relationship with the teenager until his death. Some speculate that Hadrian had him killed because he had come of age, and that, given the Roman outlook on sexual relationships between 2 free adults, he preferred to get rid of him. On the other hand, Hadrian was so smitten with the boy that he started a cult movement to deify him. Whether this event invalidates his involvement in the murder is a mystery. In her thesis on androgynes in men, gender fluidity in Republican Rome, Elizabeth Violette Jessica Sitko writes, "Bodily autonomy was one of the regulatory norms of sex which helped define one's status within society. An elite Roman male demonstrated his status because he was not allowed to be beaten or penetrated. And since the Roman religion was a reflection of their life, these ideas found their way into their deities. Since Roman mythology is derived from Greek mythology, one could also note that Zeus had several flings with both genders. In one case, he falls in love with the youthful Ganymede, takes him to Olympus, and designates him to be his cupbearer. Whereas the Greeks were freer in their sexual choices, making them without any regard for the social ladder, the Romans felt the need to be dominant. The goddess Venus is another example of a homosexual deity. Venus was revered as the goddess of all love. The Greek poet Sappho of Lesbos wrote about her. It is interesting to note the Roman disposition towards lesbian sexuality. Considering that the Romans thought of penetration as the only sexual activity, it might be possible that they were not interested in or bothered by lesbian relationships. But there are multiple examples of Roman women being in love with each other. Another deity that emphasizes female homosexuality is Diana, who preferred the company of women and ignored men completely. Today, historians are fairly certain that female homosexuality was also common in Roman times. One fascinating tale is of the Roman Emperor Trajan, who fell ill, perhaps due to poison, and died in Sicilia. His body was transferred to Rome, cremated, and buried at the base of the Great Trajan's Column. Trajan was married to Pompeia Platina, but the couple had no children whatsoever. Cassius Dio and modern historians believe that Trajan was homosexual. One of his putative lovers was his cousin and his later adopted son, Hadrian, whom Trajan made his successor under very strange circumstances on his deathbed. Hadrian might be most famous for his affair with Antoninus, But that is not his only story to feature homosexual relationships between men of different ages. Hadrian's relationship with Trajan was not perfect. He married Trajan's grandniece, but Trajan himself had never shown any intention of making him his heir. Then, dying on his bed, Trajan reportedly adopted him through a simple deathbed wish, stated before no other witnesses but his wife Plotina and prefect Antoninus, who was speculated to be Plotina's lover. Plotina signed the adoption document. From that day onwards, stories and speculations circulated, but no one will ever know what really happened. Regardless, as the Senate did not want another civil war, the legitimacy of the adoption was not disputed. The military was the first to acclaim Hadrian as emperor, and the Senate soon followed. In Rome, the attitude towards homosexuality changed over time. For instance, some historians believe that for some time in the late imperial period, homosexual marriage was openly accepted. But things quickly started to change with the arrival of Christianity. The converts left the pagan gods for the Abrahamic deity, and with the advent of Christianity, homosexuality became criminalized. The Byzantine emperor Justinian I declared it illegal in the empire and called it contrary to nature. The trend continued in the Mediterranean with Islam, which did not negate the teachings of Judaism and Christianity, but built on them. Referencing the ideas of Jung and Marx, the contemporary philosopher Slavoj Žižek often brings up the topic of ideology, and this is another example where it plays a crucial role. Marx and Jung saw an epoch, and even an individual, not as self-made, but a representation of a flowing set of ideas. For instance, people born in the Middle East are more likely to be Muslim, whereas those born in Europe are more likely to be Christian. As much as we want to think that we exist without biases, our biases are encoded into the surroundings we interact with and the ideas we consume every day. We see the Romans in light of their military might, so we impose our biases on the wider frame of reality. Yet, reality itself is entirely different.